Greetings, this is Greg. The German Albatros D.III was the most successful fighter of the First World War, which is interesting because by the numbers it's really not that impressive. If we compare it to British or French fighters from the same time period, say December of 1916 until June of 1917, we find that most are about equal to the Albatros and better in some ways. Although I want to focus on the D.III model, which is a mid-war airplane, I feel the need to have a quick review of German fighters and of the Albatros series specifically. I'll admit part of the reason for this is because there are not a lot of D.III pictures out there, so I'll have to sub in pictures of other models, and I want you to be able to recognize the various types. Keep in mind this is a quick review, so if I gloss over your favorite airplane, I'm sorry about that, but my main focus here today is the Albatros D.III. The first German fighter plane of significance was the Fokker Eindecker. This was at best a mediocre airplane, although for a time it did quite well in combat. The Eindecker was superseded by the far superior Albatros D1, seen here. The D1 was very short-lived, only about 50 were built. The cooling system was poorly designed for a combat airplane, and the location of the upper wing blocked visibility. Of course, upper wings always do, but there was room for improvement here. Soon, by mid to late 1916, the Albatros D2 came along. This is basically a D1 with a slightly relocated upper wing to improve the pilot's visibility. It's moved down and forward as compared with the previous model. They also moved the radiator into the wing so that a single bullet would not cause all the coolant to drain out suddenly as it would with the radiator below the engine, which is where it was in the D1. Yes, it's still going to leak out of the D2 if the radiator gets hit, but not as fast. More on radiators later. I commissioned some artwork by Spacer. It's an Albatros D5A in a fight with a Newport 17. I think it's beautiful and combines realism with that Saturday morning cartoon look for those of you who are old enough to know what I'm talking about. The image is available on mugs in various sizes and styles in our store. Link in the description. They are very nice, high-quality mugs. Back to our story. The Albatros D2 was the plane that started what I'll call the Albatros era, which was a period of German air dominance that lasted about 7 months from late 1916 to about mid-1917. The D2 wasn't particularly fast, nor was it all that maneuverable, so they were focused on developing a new version. Before we get to that, notice that the bottom wing on the D2 is about the same size as the upper wing, and it has parallel struts connecting them. The D3 looks something like a D2, but with very different wings. The D5 and 5A's wings look like the D3's, but the fuselage has rounded sides. I hope that helps. Now back to our story. To improve on the Albatros D2, they looked at the French Newport 17, which was much more maneuverable, and they concluded that increase in maneuverability was because of the Newport's wing layout, which was not that of a true biplane. It was a Sesquiplane, which means one wing is less than half the size of the other. In practical terms, think 1.5 wings. It's hard to put into words the total chaos that was aircraft design during World War I. There was some sound engineering and use of the scientific method, but mixed in was a lot of copycat engineering, often going down the wrong path, as well as ideas that were close to fantasy, like the ideas that planes should look like birds. World War I fighters started off as monoplanes, both French and German. Very soon, you had Sesquiplanes and biplane fighters on the scene. These stayed around until the very short-lived triplane phase. The triplane wasn't a good idea, but copycat engineering took a hold, and for a very short time, everyone seemed to be building triplanes. However, the whole idea of a triplane is unsound in principle, so only 2 of these designs worked out, one German and one British. I have a video about that, so I don't need to dwell on it anymore. Shortly after the triplane phase, it was back to biplanes, then a trend back to monoplanes, the final example being of all-metal construction and powered by an altitude engine, an early look at fighters of the future. The Albatros D3 is a Sesquiplane like the Newport 17, which influenced it. I went through all the books I have from NASA on World War I airplanes and found very little about the pros and cons of the Sesquiplane design. Even Quest for Performance, a normal go-to source for World War I aircraft data, has almost nothing to say on this. only that it helps with downward visibility. Another NASA book points out an aerodynamic advantage. By the way, I have all of these books in my Patreon section, as well as all of the documents I use in the creation of these and other videos. Please consider joining, link in the description. Quick note, memberships start at only $1. I know Patreon has a join for free button, but that doesn't get you anything. It only gives your information to Patreon. Kinda tricky if you ask me. Back to our story, there is an aerodynamic advantage of the Sesquiplane. The lower wing in a biplane usually has less lift than the upper wing, but also more drag. So an overall improvement can be made by going with a relatively large upper wing and a smaller lower wing, while maintaining the same total wing area as a biplane design. At least that's the idea. It's not exactly what happened in this case. The D.III lost some wing area as compared with the D.II, but maneuverability went up. The D.III is a fairly maneuverable airplane. The Sesquiplane idea really took hold in Germany for a time, but it does have a drawback, at least in normal usage. The problem is that the small lower wing normally has only one spar. That's the reason you see those V-struts on the Albatros D.III. Those struts connect the two spars in the upper wing to the single spar in the lower wing. The Newport 17 is the same way. Both planes had, at least for a time, problems with shedding those lower wings because they would flutter, pivoting on that single spar. The tendency of things in aviation to flutter was not fully understood probably until sometime in the 1950s. In any case, they solved this to an extent in the Albatros by strengthening things, and mostly by pilots limiting their dive speeds to known safe limits. However, before this happened, some planes and pilots were lost. The same thing happened with the Newports. Another German manufacturer, Falls, avoided this problem on their plane by using a slightly larger lower wing with two spars and a different strut design. Not quite a V, I'm not sure what to call it, but it was strong and this plane had a pretty high dive speed. Back to the Albatros D.III, it uses a liquid-cooled inline six-cylinder engine. There was an ongoing back and forth battle between liquid-cooled engines and air-cooled engines that went on for a long time. We saw that in World War II, and some of the best fighters of the war were air-cooled, and some of the best fighters of the war were liquid-cooled. A solid argument could be made for either design. In World War I, it was much the same, but with some very important differences. First, the air-cooled engines were, for the most part, rotaries, meaning the entire engine had to spin in order to have enough airflow to cool itself. The planes just didn't move fast enough to do the job, and engine design, specifically the cooling fins and cowling improvements, were not keeping up with the increase in power and thus the need to remove heat. Having the entire engine spin helps with cooling but creates certain other problems, which I talk about in my recent Sup with Camel video. The air-cooled engines are also a very inconvenient shape if you want to streamline your airplane. The liquid-cooled engines, at least in theory, can help reduce drag, but in the case of the Albatros, that doesn't happen. Every time I look at one of these planes, I imagine the frustration of the guy who designed that beautiful streamlined fuselage when he saw how the whole principle of his design was ruined by that tall engine sticking out of the cowling. So much for streamlining. The Albatros is not a low-drag airplane. In fact, it's one of the highest drag fighters of the war, which is why, in spite of its 160 horsepower, it's not very fast. Part of that drag comes from the cooling system, and I'm glad I have a chance to talk about this, as the comments on a previous video show me that quite a few people out there don't quite understand how cooling systems work. In principle, it's simple. Coolant is circulated from the engine where it absorbs the engine heat to the radiator, where it sheds that heat into the airflow that's going through the radiator core. The coolant, now cooled off, then goes back into the engine, and so on. The cycle repeats. Thus, the radiator needing airflow through its core to work creates additional drag, offsetting a big part of the reason for using a liquid-cooled engine in the first place. In World War II, the fighters powered by liquid-cooled V-12s usually had quite a bit less drag than their counterparts powered by air-cooled radials. In fact, that was the main reason for using liquid-cooled engines in fighters. But in World War I, it was quite different. Very often, air-cooled fighters had less drag. For example, the Sopwith Camel, Fokker D.R.1 triplane, and the Newport 17 all have at least 20% less drag than the Albatros D.III. So what happened between the wars to change this? It was the introduction of ethylene glycol, what we now commonly call antifreeze. As shown in this picture and quotation from the Smithsonian, this allowed for much smaller radiators and thus less cooling system drag. This is also backed up by NACA, the organization that became NASA, and it's also backed up by simply looking at airplanes through the years. The last time I mentioned this, I was flooded with comments from people telling me that I don't know what I'm talking about because water transfers heat more effectively than ethylene glycol. First of all, listen, Hot Rod, if I'm quoting from a NACA report and the information is backed up by a book on aircraft engines from the Smithsonian, before disagreeing publicly, you should probably take a step back from your keyboard and consider that maybe the folks at NACA and the Smithsonian know something you don't. Now, it's true that water cools really well. It's also true that if you go to a drag strip in the summertime, most of the really fast cars there are running water with maybe some anti-rust additives added in. They do that in part because water cools really well, better than ethylene glycol. So how is it that ethylene glycol allows for a smaller radiator in an airplane? Well, you see, it's not only about the heat transferring properties of the fluids, it's also about the boiling point. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, 100 Celsius. Once it boils, you now have no cooling as the steam won't circulate properly, and even if it did, it's not going to do much. This is fine in your summertime drag strip car, which has a big radiator and is thermostatically regulated to some fairly low temperature, probably 175 degrees Fahrenheit or thereabouts. Water is great in that application. The problem of water freezing in these applications is usually mitigated by either adding some antifreeze or simply by draining out the water and parking the car during the winter off-season. Water is not fine if you plan to run your aircraft engine at 230 degrees Fahrenheit, which was a common number in World War II fighters. The P-51, for example, has a maximum allowable temperature of 250 degrees or 121 degrees centigrade. At that temperature, actually well before it, that water will turn to steam and the engine will turn to a pile of junk in short order. Now, you can raise that boiling point by pressurizing the cooling system, and that was commonly done in World War II. But it takes a lot of cooling system pressure to make water work at 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That much pressure creates a whole new set of problems. So an easier way to do it is to run a mix of ethylene glycol and water and run lower pressure. This works because the ethylene glycol has a boiling point that's very high. Thus, the smaller radiators and lower cooling system drag has nothing to do with the heat transferability of water versus anything else. It's all about the boiling point of the fluid. You can run a smaller radiator with ethylene glycol because you can run the engine at a higher temperature without destroying it. Back to our Albatros D.III. It can't do that, so it has to run water, which means it needs a big radiator. That big radiator is located in the upper wing. It's shaped like the wing, and the cooling airflow goes from the relatively high pressure area under the wing and exhausts its way out through the top. The early D3s had it located in the center of the wing, but then any radiator leak would scald the pilot, so they offset it to the right pretty early on in the production run. The amount of airflow through the radiator is controlled by a handle located below it. The pilot has to reach up out of the cockpit to manipulate it. The Albatros D3's engine was usually a Mercedes six-cylinder D3. The D3 designation for the engine is not named after the plane. It's just that German engine manufacturers use the same sort of numbering system as the aircraft manufacturers, and sometimes the numbers lined up. The typical variant of this engine used in the Albatros D3 was rated at 160 horsepower. The Germans had a little different way of rating horsepower, which resulted in slightly lower numbers as compared with British ratings. It's not much different, though. It works out to about 162.5 horsepower on the British scale. This data is from the Airplane Engine Encyclopedia from 1921, a very old book. It's an incredible 570-page book and can be found in high-resolution PDF form in my Patreon section. It's very clearly an old-time engine, that is the Mercedes D3. Now, it does have some almost modern features, which I'll get to, but the basic construction method is ancient. Most modern engines are built around what we call the block. That is the part which houses the crankshaft, cylinders, and more. Most of the main components are within the block or bolted to the block. Older engines were built in a very different way. Instead of a block, the Mercedes has a crankcase, which is in two halves, an upper and lower. They are aluminum and bolted together with a lot of hardware, and they enclose the crankshaft. The cylinders themselves are not cast into the crankcase. It's not like a block. Instead, they're machined out of steel, and they have a steel jacket going around them for cooling. There's a lot of steel going on here. Those cylinders are bolted to the crankcase with really long bolts. Why are the bolts so long? Well, because those bolts hold on the cylinders, but they also hold the crankshaft in place. If you're used to typical automotive engines, this will seem very foreign to you, but the main bearing caps are bolted in from above via the cylinder hold-down bolts. No doubt if you've worked on modern automotive engines, this will seem very foreign to you, but it was common back then and it seemed to work just fine. By modern standards, this is a very odd way of constructing an engine, but it worked and was more or less the way things were done building engines for a number of decades. The engine does have some modern features. It has overhead cam, opposed valves, and a combustion chamber that wouldn't look out of place on a 1960s European automobile. The camshaft and rockers were exposed, meaning there was no valve cover and it would throw oil out, although they tried to minimize this with baffles and felt packing, which absorb the oil, but it still throws oil out. It's said that one of the reasons World War I pilots wore scarves was to wipe oil off the windscreen in their goggles, which I think is almost certainly true. The engine weighs in at 618 pounds dry. Once you add in the oil tank, radiator, and coolant, it's a lot heavier. This contributes to the high weight of the Albatros D.III. Now, some of these planes were equipped with the 200 horsepower Austro-Daimler six-cylinder engine, but these were rare. Often they had a cowling with some greater attempt at streamlining. I'll talk about these versions of the Albatros another time, another video. The fuselage of the Albatros was pretty advanced. Typical planes from the period used what was called braced box girder type construction. For example, the Sopwith Camel's fuselage is made from a series of wooden squares, which decrease in size as they get closer to the tail. And there's quite a bit of metal hardware involved here too, including a lot of internal bracing wires in the structure. The whole thing is then covered with canvas. The fuselage of the Albatros is quite a bit different. It's a semi-monocoque structure, which means it has minimal internal bracing, and it's covered with plywood skin. This was lighter and stronger than the braced box designs and allowed for very effective streamlining. Of course, that streamlining didn't really work because nothing else about this airplane is low drag, but the fuselage itself is quite nice. The horizontal tail on the Albatros looks interesting. I've never come across anything explaining the reason for this design. I'm pretty sure it's a remnant of the period when designers were trying to make planes look like birds, and it sort of looks streamlined. Of course, this tail design was abandoned by other manufacturers pretty early on, and Albatros was one of the last holdouts to still use it. One big feature of the Albatros was the dual Spandau machine gun synchronized to fire through the propeller. This gave it about twice the firepower of typical Allied fighters from late 1916 to mid-1917. Don't underestimate the importance of this advantage. Performance of the Albatros was okay. Not great, but not bad. I'll start by comparing speeds. It's actually really hard to compare speeds of World War I airplanes as the data is never complete throughout the plane's altitude range, and it's inconsistent from one source to the next. The best source I have puts the Albatros D.III with the 160 horsepower engine at 109 miles per hour at 3,280 feet. As it goes higher, it slows down. At the low indicated airspeeds at higher altitudes, the plane's induced drag goes up, and that affects it disproportionately to many competing fighters. This has a lot to do with the Albatros's relatively high stall speed. For comparison, a Newport 17 would do 107 miles per hour at 6,500 feet and 101 at 10,000. At 6,500 feet, the Albatros is down to 96 miles per hour, and at 13,100 down to 93. Remember, these numbers are true airspeeds. 93 miles per hour in this case is only 76 miles per hour calibrated. The closer an airplane gets to its stall speed, the more induced drag goes up, and then the more it slows down, and so on. The relatively high stall speed is hurting the Albatros here. Let's bring in two more planes, the Sopwith Pup and the Sopwith Triplane. As you can see, the triplane with its 130 horsepower engine is faster than the D.III at all altitudes, and the pup is about equal down low, but clearly faster up high. In terms of climb performance, the Albatros isn't exactly stellar. It's graphed here against other World War I fighters. I'll add in some color to the Albatros line for clarity. As you can see, it can outclimb very early fighters like the Fokker-Eindecker or the British Th-2, but it's behind nearly everything else shown here. The pup and triplane are not on this graph, so I'll add in some data for them. The pup's 80 horsepower engine just isn't enough, which is why it was replaced by the triplane and then the Camel. The Sopwith triplane can outclimb the Albatros, although just barely, and the Newport 17 can outclimb the Albatros D.III, the pup, or the Sopwith triplane quite easily. In terms of maneuverability, the two Sopwiths and the Newport probably have the edge over the Albatros in most areas. The Newport has a better power-to-weight ratio and lower wing loading. Considering their wings are similar in design, I just don't see the Albatros coming out ahead here. The pup's power-to-weight ratio is worse than the Albatros's, but the pup has literally half the wing loading. Now, it's not that the Albatros isn't maneuverable. It is, and it has the advantage here over the Spad 7, which was a common opponent, and over all of the two-seaters, which were frequent opponents on the Western Front. I realize I sort of left out the Spad 7, which may have been the best of the late 1916 fighters, but I suppose that's for another video. Also, when looking at all of the data, the Albatros D.III doesn't seem to be superior to its rivals, yet it had a period of dominance during the first 4 months of 1917, and was probably the most successful fighter of the First World War. Now, records are scarce on this, but it looks like the Albatros D.III shot down more enemy planes than any other World War I fighter, and if not, it's darn close, so there's no denying it was hugely successful for about 6 months. Part of the reason it's hard to tell is it's hard to differentiate between an Albatros D.III and a D.5 in terms of kills in a certain month. Now, a lot of people attribute the end of the Albatros era to the newer British and French fighters, the Sopwith Camel, SE-5A, Spad 13, and those airplanes were a big factor. But let's not forget that the Allies had fighters at least equal, probably slightly superior to the Albatros during the time in which the Albatros was dominant. In fact, by the numbers, the Albatros D.III is only a mediocre fighter. So why was it so successful? Well, there is no one reason. There rarely is in a situation like this. But let's start off and go through them. First of all, engine longevity. The 160 horsepower Mercedes D.III engine had a time between overhauls of 109 hours. That's not much by today's standards, but it was over 5 times longer than the typical rotary engines of the time. Considering that fact, I think it's likely that most of the Albatros fighters were operating with engines that still had their factory fresh levels of power, or at least close to it. I don't think that was the case for many of the rotaries. In other words, that 110 horsepower Newport 17 may have been down to 95 horsepower when facing a D.III on any given day, and if so, the performance advantage would tilt towards the Albatros. The bigger factors were the timing of the plane's introduction and the strategies and tactics in use at the time. Let's talk about the timing. The D.III came, of course, right after the D.II, which was a dominant airplane. The D.IIs killed off a lot of Allied pilots and also created some very experienced German fighter pilots who became leaders around the time of the D.III's introduction. The Germans had the edge in numbers of experienced fighter pilots during the Albatros era. Then you had the British tactic of sending in obsolete types of two-seat observation aircraft, often unescorted, and the D.IIIs had a lot of easy targets. For example, we have the Royal Aircraft Factory BE-2. This is a fine non-combat airplane by 1912 standards, which is when it first flew. However, as a frontline plane in 1917, it is beyond hopeless. A really good version of this plane has a top speed of maybe 72 miles per hour, and can't realistically climb above 10,000 feet. It was one of the least maneuverable airplanes in the sky and was normally flown by inexperienced pilots. Oh, and just to make it completely hopeless, the defensive machine gun was operated by the observer who was in the front seat. Thus, the structure of the plane, the rear cockpit and pilot, bracing wires, and so on seriously limited the gunner's field of fire. BE-2s were easy prey, and the British kept sending them in large numbers over and over, and the Albatrosses kept shooting them down in large numbers over and over. The British also sent in a lot of FE-2s up through April of 1917. This plane's gunner is also in the front seat. Not only does he have to contend with the structure of the airplane when firing to the rear, but he also has to worry about hitting the propeller. An Albatros can attack these from directly astern with near impunity. Not total impunity, though. If diving in from above, the rear gunner in the FE-2 could be a threat. The Red Baron famously learned this the hard way while flying an Albatros D5. The FE-2s made up a large portion of Albatros kills, and the lumbering pusher plane was finally pulled from operational patrols into German-dominated airspace in April of 1917. The BE-2s were fading out around the same time and being replaced with RE-8s. Now, the RE-8 was a big step up. It was faster than the BE-2, a lot faster, and had decent defensive firepower. But these were still shot down in droves until the Royal Flying Corps started to change tactics. The German fighter squadrons were early adopters of effective rules and tactics. They were just a step ahead of the British in this regard. Last but not least, the Albatros was relatively easy to fly. All the fighters from this period were pretty close in performance, so a pilot that can get 100% out of his Albatros may actually have a performance advantage over an equal pilot who is only able to get 90% from his tricky-to-fly but technically higher-performing machine. It's this combination of factors that allowed the Albatros to dominate from late 1916 up through April of 1917. The Albatros is a decent airplane, but its huge level of success wasn't due to the airplane's performance. It was a case of the right airplane at the right time. That's all for now. If you like this video, please subscribe and check back in. I have a lot more on this channel, and I'm adding more all the time. Check out my Patreon. There I have a lot of older non-copyrighted books and government materials in PDF form. Essentially everything I used for source materials in this and other videos on this channel. Goodbye and have a great day. Oh, and just one more thing. Since we have an Albatros D5A mug with artwork by Spacer, I want to talk about that plane for a moment. After the D3, Albatros came out with the D5, which had 180 horsepower, up from 160, but was slightly heavier and not much of an improvement. The D5A came along shortly after, with some strengthening and small improvements, eventually further increases in power, including an overcompressed 200 horsepower Mercedes engine. That kept the D5A relevant until the end of the war. If you don't know what an overcompressed engine is, well, I have a video about that, which is part of my World War I playlist. Regarding the D5, the German pilots were somewhat disappointed in it. After the D2 and D3, they must have been looking forward to a new Albatros to help them deal with the new improved British and French planes like the Sopwith Camel and the Spad 13. However, when the D5 showed up, it had performance only slightly better than the D3 and worse in some ways. Still, the D5A, especially with that overcompressed engine, was somewhat competitive, and it soldiered on until the end of the war, although it was largely replaced by newer designs. A link to more of Spacer's artwork can be found in the video description. That really is all for now. Goodbye and have a great day.